So I guess, we've talked a little bit about the AMR statement, and I guess, without going through it again, I think, it was pretty challenging for me as a veterinarian, but generally for the NZVA to come out with a statement like that. But to some degree the proof's in the eating, because we're now sort of 18 months down the track, and the whole intent of making that statement and the whole thought of that group that was that devised that sort of strategic statement, as contentious as it was and as difficult as it was for the profession to understand, was that we actually captured the agenda, we captured the conversation and removed the possibility of anyone else having that discussion for us. And I guess the risk was that we were very aware that the pressure was mounting from overseas, that New Zealand was certainly going to be forced to take a position, particularly the Ministry of Primary Industries, because they didn't have one. And that if we allowed that to happen, it was very likely that someone else would tell us what we couldn't do in terms of our access and use of antimicrobials. So, as part of this sort of new thinking, the way to respond to that is to seize the agenda, and that's what that statement was all about. So it probably came as a shock to a lot of people in the profession that A, that we were prepared to say, and B, that we said it at all. But what it has done is absolutely captured that conversation for us as a profession now. So no one can challenge us on the fact that we have an agenda, that we've set a timeline, and that we are working towards a strategy that that really forces everyone else to come in line with us and join the bandwagon. And the great illustration of it is actually, which I didn't mention last night, I haven't told you about this either, but I was at Auckland Airport yesterday about to fly to Tauranga, and a girl came up to me that used to be our old Hills rep, and she works for another company. And she brought the Southeast Asian director of that company up, and she said, "Oh, this is Callum from NZVA, and he's the person you need to blame." And I was sort of like, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about." But the reason that company was here in New Zealand is that the New Zealand Poultry Association have brought them in to have a discussion about finding alternatives to the use of antimicrobials in feed in chickens to meet our 2030 agenda. So, we're in the airport, and someone that I don't even know has come up to me and said, actually, the whole reason that we're now here in this country is because of the statement that you guys made, and we're now working with an industry to make meaningful change to the use of antimicrobials. So that kind of stuff just reinforces why we said what we said and the value in it. But there's some other stuff that we're doing, I guess, and my job is really just to kind of illustrate to you some of the things that we're doing and why it's a little bit different to what we've done before. So the first one is probably cat management, and I've said the last couple of nights, if you ever want to get emails from crazy people, then get involved in cat management, because I'm starting a collection of the most ridiculous emails that I can get from crazy cat ladies across New Zealand and actually internationally, who now have my email address and feel that it's their sole duty to spam me with emails.
Crazy cat men?
There are no crazy cat men, not one. It's solely a women's profession. One day I'm going to publish them all in a vet strip, and the best vet strip you've ever had. So cat management's a great example, because when Gareth Morgan kind of thrust this into the public domain, we did what we would traditionally do as a profession, which was to initially commission a literature review, spend quite a lot of time examining the science, and put out an enormously comprehensive literature review on the issue, which we released with great fanfare and a big media release, and nothing happened at all. No one really cared, because the literature's all there, they could have looked it up themselves. So we sort of thought, well, that's interesting, we've taken a science-based approach, and that really didn't do anything for us. How can we influence this in a different way? How can we lead this conversation? So what we did do was go and sit down with Gareth Morgan, which was really interesting, because what it turns out is that actually he's not too far away from what we want to achieve as well. The way he goes about achieving it might be very different, but actually we have a lot in common. And then we thought, well, that's interesting, we could probably work with these guys. We also need to work with people like the RNZ SPCA, so we met with them. And a very similar outcome, except that they said, well, we don't want to work with the Morgan Foundation. The Morgan Foundation said, well, we're not working with them. So we thought, well, let's just put them all in a room together and see what happens. So that's exactly what we did. And what's eventuated is now a national cat management strategy group, which we're leading. So we've got sitting around that table not only the Morgan Foundation and RNZ-SPCA, but the New Zealand Companion Animal Council, local government New Zealand, DOC, MPI, some others who don't spring to mind immediately, but basically a national high-level group of organisations who have significant national influence and are also linked to government, who are forging a way forward in terms of developing a strategy and framework for cat management in this country. And that's entirely our doing. That's been led by the NZVA, and there's an enormous amount of kudos that comes with that. But we also think that it's really important because, fundamentally, this is the space that we should own. We should be occupying this space. And although we haven't been out in the media speaking about this a lot and spouting about it, we've been working very hard behind the scenes to get to a point where we actually can go forward. And it will be the NZVA that becomes one of the principal spokespeople for this strategy when it goes out, speaking about what cat management and responsible cat ownership and solutions for cat management in this country might be. And it's a really difficult issue, and there are a lot of people with a lot of vested interests, a lot of different agendas, and it's an enormous juggling act. But at the end of the day, we are very, very close to having an agreed framework between some big organisations nationally that we can put on the table and say, okay, this is the way forward for this country in terms of finding solutions for cat management. So that's a big deal, and it's fantastic to be involved in that. I guess the next one down, the Regional Animal Welfare Coordination, is just another example of us doing things a little bit differently. So after the Christchurch earthquakes, it became very, very apparent that when it comes to animals in the civil defence emergency, there's absolutely no structure in this country around how to deal with them. So when the earthquake happened in Christchurch, there was no way of managing the animal-related issues that came out of that, and it was frankly a debacle. And, short of some pretty impressive vet work on the ground by local vets, it would have been a huge animal welfare issue. So what arose out of that was that animals needed to be included in the Civil Defence Emergency Management Plan, and so it's been an enormous amount of work actually writing an animal welfare section for that plan, which we've been heavily involved in alongside others. And we now have animal welfare as a key component of any civil defence emergency, and the NZVA is a key leader in that. So in the event of a civil defence emergency, we'd be one of the first people to be involved in overseeing the animal welfare response. But what arose out of that is that actually regionally there needs to be someone who manages animals in a civil defence emergency, and so MPI put a tender out to find out whether they could identify those people. And it was really just a broad tender to all the usual suspects, people like Assure Quality and so on. And we thought, well, we'll have a crack at it. Why not? And see if we can actually land this. So in typical MPI fashion, I think we had about 2 days to turn around. It was pretty short. But we
and before Christmas.
Just before Christmas. So we threw a tender together, and we've won it. So the NZVA now owns the rights to deliver civil defence management of animals across New Zealand. So that's a really important step for the profession, because what it means is that, and we're in the very early phases of this, so we've only just actually got the tender. But what we're going to do now is actually develop a framework for animal management in a civil defence welfare sort of situation, and that means identifying people at each local region who will be leaders in the event of a civil defence emergency, and who will actually be the person that steps up and runs the show. So that's fantastic, because it's not somewhere that the profession might have been normally. And there are areas of New Zealand who are already well down the pathway. Actually, I think Taranaki is one that's well recognised as being way ahead of the other areas in terms of the civil defence management already. But it means that we're putting vets into places that traditionally they wouldn't have been, and that can only be good for the profession to be seen to be leading these kind of things. So maybe the other one, I guess, that I might talk about there is just regulatory reform. And so after the Animal Welfare Act amendment bill was passed, one of the fundamental things in that was that it made a provision for NAWAC, or National Animal Welfare Advisory Committee, to make recommendations on regulations. So under the minimum standards in the codes of welfare, NAWAC is allowed to recommend a whole lot of things that become legally enforceable in terms of animal welfare standards, which is not a situation we've had in the past. So we've had minimum standards that people should prescribe to, but didn't have to. And so if they didn't, there was no way of enforcing it. And we're now moving into the phase of actually having enforceable standards that you will be prosecuted or punished or otherwise for if you don't meet them. And that's been across a whole broad umbrella of things. So it's not just bobby calves, but it's also been around companion animals, across all industries really. And so we've been involved in making a huge number of recommendations, everything from the banning of tail docking, banning of debarking of dogs, through to the banning of Scottish fold cats as a breed, but then also into areas like bobby calf welfare and reform. And I guess the reason that we've got bobby calves up there is because it's a really good example of us trying to do something a little bit differently. So when SAFE did their expose on bobby calves, there was a pretty overwhelming industry response, and we were immediately sort of pulled into what's called the bobby calf stakeholder associations, which is sort of MPI, Dairy NZ, and all of these kind of guys, who wanted to put a response together and really just sort of say, okay, we're doing something, but in a way sort of maintaining the status quo and just shoring up what already existed. And we sort of thought, well, that's okay, but actually we need to kind of we need to kind of rethink this and think whether we could be doing a better job. So we sat down with the DCV guys in December and said, well, let's have a think about this. Let's think about what the best case scenario would be, and we put a bit of a framework together. And then we actually pulled together a sort of technical advisory group, I guess, a bunch of vets who had a bit of specialty in this area alongside some people with behavioural and welfare expertise. And we sat around the table and said, let's put aside all our biases, let's put aside all the things that we know that we can't do or that are just too difficult to do, or they're going to get in the way, or it's just transport industry can't do that. And let's actually have a think about starting from square one and saying what would be the best case outcomes in terms of bobby calves, what would be the best outcome for the calf, and what could we do differently to reform the industry. And we actually developed a sort of 10-point plan, which we then sent out to all the industry partners and stakeholders that we're associated with as part of the consultation process. And it was sort of relatively coldly received, I guess. A lot of people said it's too hard, can't be done, it isn't going to work. But what we found over time is that when we actually went out and sold that message through the groups that met to discuss these issues over the last sort of 3 or 4 months, that many of those groups actually started to come around and see where we were coming from and understand why things might be done differently and why there might be a way of doing things better for bobby calves that wasn't just sticking to the old paradigm. And I guess that the great thing about that is that today, literally this afternoon, we've had the notification come through from MPI of their proposed regulatory reform package, and it is effectively the NZVA 10-point plan. So they have, in essence, adopted exactly what we proposed to industry, which is an enormous coup for the profession, because we were sort of a lot of people sort of said, well, this is not really your space. I mean, vets don't really have that much to do with bobby calves. It's not really your area. It's sort of off another side of the farm from you guys. So why are you getting involved? But we've actually fundamentally achieved what we set out to, and it looks like the industry is going to look very different as a result of what we actually put forward and what we've advocated for strongly on behalf of the profession, but also on behalf of just good welfare outcomes for bobby calves generally.